We're really lucky right now because we have two people, especially given the last day and a half, but the session with Mark, two people from the U.S. government who can talk about these issues from their perspectives. But in particular, we're lucky that, you know, the two guys who are up here. Joseph Alm, you know, you have the bio in the program. He's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Security at the Department of Homeland Security. What actually is important is it's economic security. And one of the things within your office, Joseph, at DHS is, you know, you look at, right, investment and bringing investment in as well as securing it, right? And people don't necessarily think of that as part of the DHS remit, but it is, and it's really important. The other thing about Joseph is he has experience in the private sector. So you understand what industry needs, but you also understand what government needs in terms of the security issues. And I'll get to the question in a moment. And then Steve Lang, Ambassador Lang, is a career Foreign Service officer. And he served as the U.S. Coordinator for International Communications and Information Policy, which is a mouthful at the State Department. That's, you know, a lot of government positions have long names. But he was also the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Information and Communications, and was instrumental in developing the U.S. government's partnership with private sector, especially around the Pacific Connect cable, right? Connecting some of the really strategic Pacific islands. He also, by the way, again, Bill, thanks for talking about you keep calling it, I forget the 100-pound gorilla or whatever, but some of the China issues. Steve's a China hand, right? So you were, as part of the State Department, based in China, Taiwan, USTR, trade rep, focusing on the region. So we're really lucky that we have, you know, Steve and Joseph from their perspectives. And Joseph, I mean, the first question sort of, you know, leading off is, how are you, right, you, but also DHS and the administration, approaching the challenge of attracting investment, but securing the investment? So it's privately owned critical communications infrastructure, and then there's the supply chains. How do you navigate and balance that? Because that's actually the critical part, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of things that go into, you know, this job that I've been currently implementing. You know, one of those is Supply Chain Resilience Center. It's kind of building out the resilience of the supply chain, making sure that it is less able to be disrupted. There's the investment side, which is making sure that we are getting, pursuant to the America First investment policy by President Trump, we're getting, you know, much more capital into the United States to enable this broad effort that we have to redomesticate manufacturing here, and also to drive forward the economy, to kind of place the great engines of production in the United States that will then allow us to progress, you know, in prosperity. I look at this time, you know, right now as one of the most exciting opportunities in American history, in world history, in that we've had an environment where labor drives everything forward in integration with resources, in integration with intellectual property and other things. We're getting to a place where automation will enable us to produce things without much human effort at all. And there's a question of, are we going to win in this global competition to place these engines of production here first? Because the people who do that first are likely the ones who are going to have that vast economic power, that vast economic growth, and that vast prosperity for themselves and for their people. And so, you know, I in the private sector, I spent 12 years in litigation. I was at Tesla for 4 years doing supply chain, all their supply chain and IP litigation. Before that, believe it or not, I actually did 9 years of construction. So I kind of understand a little bit of the you know, real world. little bit. But the thing that drew me in, to work in this administration is that, the president has appropriately and clearly identified that we are in a new era. America, for the past several decades, was in a hegemonic position that was essentially unchallenged, with the fall of the Soviet Union. And we operated as such, which is fine. But that's not the era we are entering. We're now entering a different era, one of something more like, I've been playing with terms for this, but there's like a bounded hegemony, an idea that there are other great powers emerging. There is a great power conflict, and all of these economic challenges that we face are in that context of this sort of economic challenge. And so to come back to your question more specifically, in all of these things, what I have to continually articulate, being at a national security agency, is that in the long run, national security is downstream from economic dominance. And so while we always have to secure our infrastructure, and there's a lot of specific things that I have to do day in and day out to do that, Team Telecom, CFIUS, the like, we also always have to be thinking about how do we make sure our companies, our people, drive forward and have more opportunities and succeed on the global stage. And so I can go into specifics and nuances on all of that, but that's kind of the broader base with which we approach this. When we're looking at investment coming in, we're always analyzing how can we get this investment in? Does it have some sort of poison pill? Is there something here that's dangerous to America? If it is, okay, great, we'll sequester it out. If it's adversary investment that's particularly concerning, sequester it out. But otherwise, pursuant to the president's directives, we see the need for vast deployments of capital to start driving this forward. And
and I know that one of the things that you've been working on is also, how do we eliminate some of the bumps in the road to get the investment? I mean, what are the things that are needed to increase some of the certainty so that we can have the innovation, the investment in innovation, and the growth that you're talking about? Because it's really about sort of economic competition as much as anything else. So from where you've been for the last several months, what kinds of bumps in the road or things that you see that could be either streamlined? I mean, that's at a general matter. We'll get maybe a moment to the Team Telecom and some of the nitty-gritty stuff on the security side. But what are you seeing that just maybe have popped up as a good example of what can be done to facilitate more investment?
Well, I think, the point on Team Telecom is a fantastic one, which is, I looked at this and I saw we have taken 2+ years for approvals for, specific subsea cable deployments, for example. That can't happen, right? Like, more broadly when we're approaching this, and what I've articulated with my team, what the administration has been advancing more broadly, is we need to not be adding bureaucratic layers that impose limitations beyond those imposed in the physical world. We're starting to build out all these physical things, right? America stopped doing that for a long time, and that was catastrophic and bad. And now we're back to doing that, right? And rebuilding infrastructure and rebuilding, data centers and rebuilding manufacturing. But that requires a lot of work. It's hard. It's hard work to build the physical, stuff to actually deploy the subsea cables and that like. Industry's not going to get to a point where they're doing that in a couple weeks. It's going to take them a lot of time. But what we need to always make sure is how do we harness the bureaucratic apparatus and get it to fit within the physical constraints of the real world so that the bureaucratic apparatus isn't slowing down business and industry. So that's the first piece, is a timing piece and how to solve that. We're working on that. The second piece is a certainty piece, which is, coming from the private sector, I understand y'all are making investments all the time. Y'all are figuring out what can I invest in? What level of risk is there here? When a lobbyist or a lawyer or someone else tells you, yeah, you can put $500 million in that cable deployment, it might get approved, maybe. Who knows? That's not going to work. So we're working on trying to create systems that are much more predictable, that allow confident deployment of capital in the subsea cable space. And the reason that I mentioned that specifically is this broader rise in connectivity is key. It's key in this hybrid of economic and national security interests. In that, as these, basically AI proliferates around the world, we want to be the global leader in AI. We want to be the ones who are the best at this and who the rest of the world uses to drive everything forward. But in order to do that, our companies have to be able to transmit data across the world seamlessly, easily, immense amounts of data. And that key piece is one that we recognize as geopolitically relevant. And then there's also the layer on top of that, which is something that I always approach in kind of thinking of this space, which is resilience through redundancy. It's essentially that you want to get the networks around the world to a state where essentially they are now resilient because the mesh network is so robust that even if you lose a line or two and there's some phishing thing, you don't have to worry about it because you can redirect traffic wherever you need. And getting to that stable state involves confident deployment of capital, and getting to a confident deployment of capital involves the government not getting in the way. So we're working on that.
And predictability.
Absolutely.
That's actually a real key. And so, maybe just, Steve, on some of the things that you saw with the Pacific Connect and what was needed there, and what was the decision set that led to government working with private sector, right, to add branches, add spurs, and connect the islands, and what was needed? What was that process, and how does that fit in to the kind of predictability that Joseph was talking about?
Right. Well, I was leading a team at the State Department with the Pacific Connect project that was working on advancing trusted ICT infrastructure around the world. And I think part of that work, it builds on some of the objectives that Joseph was talking about. In addition to wanting to bring investment to the United States, we also prioritize making sure that ICT infrastructure around the world relied on trusted equipment from trusted providers, essentially those that are not beholden to authoritarian regimes in China or elsewhere. So in addition to the economic benefits to the United States, Pacific Connect was a partnership with Google where we gathered other allies in the region, Australia, Japan, and others, to work together with us to help finance and fund additional connectivity that was not so much commercially viable for Google, that would allow connectivity for Pacific Island countries and prevent that connectivity from being provided by Chinese companies. And we see that as important. I should mention that, so at the State Department, I'm wrapping up my career of about 30 years. And the last 10 years or so, I've focused primarily on tech issues. But the previous 10 years, I worked mostly on China, as you mentioned, and in China, in Taiwan, on the China desk of the State Department and elsewhere. And so that the US strategic competition with China is really the lens through which I view tech policy. And Joseph, I thought you put it very well to say that national security is downstream from our economic dominance. And I would go a step further and say that to a large extent, our economic dominance is downstream from our tech competitiveness. And that's why this competition with China is so critical, and not only because of our national security and our economic prosperity, but also because how we use technology is critical to our democracy and our values, our freedom of expression, and we want to make sure that networks are built around the world by providers that are from countries that take the same rights-respecting approach to technology. So that means promoting US companies, and in our work, that was always our first priority, to try to make sure that US companies were able to compete, companies that build equipment and create jobs in the United States. And in some sectors, this is the problem where there aren't US companies that are able to compete, to make sure that ICT infrastructure is built by other trusted providers. And that's part of the reason that we worked hard to build alliances with other countries that shared our rights-respecting approach to technology, to make sure that we can all compete with China effectively. And then also to work closely with companies to make sure that they are getting the tools from the United States and other governments that will allow them to to be able to match China or Chinese companies and beat them in strategic tenders.
Yeah, and Joseph, along those lines, what are you seeing in terms of sort of the competition by U.S. companies and companies from trusted partners in the tech space being able to deploy, globally? And what are some of the concerns and focuses that you have on the secure supply chain?
Oh man, that's a huge question. I can go so deep. Okay, let's start off. So first off, you all had previous discussions on the power front with many people, but that's a clean spot that we all have visibility on, right? China has been very intentional and aware of the imminent need, the ongoing need, but it will continue to escalate, of power and essentially the underproduction as it relates to AI, right? That has to be solved. There's a path to solve that, which is essentially modular nuclear reactors that are pre-approved, that you get a set of preordained basically designs that we are able to verify the safety, the security, all these other things. We can go through a process to get all of that done. And then it's just a question of get the power, get the water hookups, like make it fast, make these deployments, again, predictable, fast. And then what you allow from that is you allow deployments that happen on the backside, not in the grid. You solve for two problems. You, one, are solving for the data centers that need, this crazy amount of power consumption. You're also solving for grid instability and weakness at the same time. And we have an edge on China on this, which is our modular reactor companies are better. Like, we are positioning our tech better than China on that front. We just need to make sure, and the administration is focused on making sure, that we can get past the kind of bureaucratic barriers to using that technology to drive us forward. So that's one piece, that I go into and we've been working on. On the supply chain side, there's a couple different layers. So there's critical minerals. We're all honed in on that. Basically, how do you get in the right set of raw materials? But on that, I've also been driving a lot of that focus into refining, because China's been systematic about acquiring and controlling refining capabilities. They did this, for example, the lithium market. I think it was like 85%. It was a huge amount, and they did that in order to acquire the control over that market. And so we're being systematic about how do we start to reshore that capacity, and where do we start reshoring it to make sure that those supply lines are resilient. And that has a lot of focus and interest, and there's a lot of opportunity there. I would also say, stepping back, there's kind of a couple sets of things that I look at. There's like, okay, you need the machining, you need essentially the automated arms, you need the ability to build factory lines. But what happens, I think there's a potential gap. It's not a full gap, but what I would say is there's room for immense opportunity for a skill set, which is people who can quickly deploy factories to produce things, simple things. Back in my automotive years, you have 5 layers or more of suppliers, right? And if you miss, part 173 and supplier number 5, you can get a factory shut down, right? And so as we re-domesticate and everything's starting to come back here, it becomes more important for us to be able to stand up those gaps whenever they arise. And the ability to do that is something that I look out, and I'm always looking to try to find where are the people who have that ability to go in and create widget number 5 quickly. And then the other thing that I'll just close on this like broader thing, I could go on forever, I won't, forgive me, is in this space, that deployment is a great opportunity, because we engaged, in NAFTA and otherwise, in kind of offshoring American manufacture, and the president has rightly identified that as a catastrophic error that we're since fixing. But part of that was a labor arbitrage game, right? It was, we wanted cheap labor, and there was a lot of opportunity there where you send it overseas, now we make a ton more money. Okay, at least I understand why they did it, don't agree with it. But now there's an opportunity that AI is enabling, and it's not just LLMs, it goes far beyond that into like vision integration and more broadly mass manufacture. But there's an opportunity to have these factories not have to be dependent on cheap labor, but be dependent on less skilled labor.
Smart labor.
Exactly.
So, so wearing your economic security hat, right, and economic growth, economic competition, are you having conversations with companies who can do that kind of thing? And are you having those conversations to try to get those companies to make investments and stand up those production lines? Because that's not something that people think of DHS doing.
Yeah, what I would say that I've been very, just almost kind of surprised and shocked at how open everyone is in the administration. I mean, you really can't go talk with anyone to make anything happen. And so one of the things that the administration is remarkably good at is recognizing, oh, hey, here's this problem. You seem like you might be able to solve it. Go solve it. And so one example on this kind of supply chain side is the ability to just go and talk with my colleagues over in commerce or my colleagues over at the NSC or elsewhere, right? Just talk with people to figure out, what are we doing on this? Oh, how can we fix this? Here's some gaps. What resources can we deploy there? And so there has been a lot of that. And I'm very optimistic about the future, given the team that's been assembled on this and the sort of integration that we're achieving and will, I hopefully grow in with government and business working together to kind of drive America into this new era of what we view as the golden age.
Maybe we can just come back for a moment to, you had mentioned, sort of the team telecom process. One of the questions that comes from industry, it again goes to the predictability, right? And if they have a cable that goes through a process, right, and negotiations on the national security agreement, the mitigations, you've got it. Now, they come back with another cable, right, that's very similar, but having to, in the past, go through the same process again. Do you see a way in which that, again, analogous to the small modular reactors, once I have a playbook, you're comfortable with it, it's secure, do you think that model can apply to things like cables, or are they too bespoke in terms of the uniqueness?
I mean, my view is that this space isn't bespoke. There's some difference of opinion on that I'm trying to navigate through. But ultimately, yeah, you have different countries. You have mildly different threat vectors. But ultimately, and this is reflected to some extent in the FCC, coming out with its rulemaking on this front, this needs to be a space that is much more homogeneous and much less bespoke than it is. There's no reason that we need to make this a process that every single cable is going to get many years of us looking at this particular thing. The broader threat picture is understood. The broader solution picture is actually understood. And so in that context, I view it as essentially an anachronism that we just didn't solve it already, but we'll solve it.
So because one of the ways to think about it is that the process is more like product development, in that I have product, my engineer's developing it, we test it, right? We go back and we iterate, and then we have a product and we ship. And then once I've shipped the product and I've gone through all of the reviews, the testing, et cetera, that model has not necessarily been used in government processes before. But it's not identical, it's an analogy, but it is a model, I think, to use that does scale, because one of the things we've been talking about here is one of the critical factors is scale. So it's time to market and scale in order to achieve the goals that we want to achieve. And so that may be a way to think about it. Just kind of curious what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I strongly agree with that. I mean, part of what I am always looking at here is you have, a lot of times players will drive through this very complex or difficult regulatory process. And they'll build an apparatus to do that. And actually it kind of becomes a competitive moat. And I also had antitrust law in one of my things. One of the things I'm always trying to do is get us away from, okay, just because this company and this company made it through this bureaucratic hurdle, that doesn't mean this bureaucratic hurdle is okay to sit around forever, right? Think about, what is it that it solved? Is there a way to solve it in a systemic way that doesn't require a large amount of expended effort and capital? Because we have to have our human efforts being dedicated to the real problems as much as possible.
Well, this always goes back to what's the problem you're solving for. Exactly. Yeah. Steve, so what's the problem you're solving for? Again, going back to some of the Pacific Connect issues. And were there things that popped up that, you hadn't actually seen as part of that? Again, going back to some of the supply chain questions, the partnering questions, and what were some of the difficulties, either on the company side or looking to partner? I mean, you mentioned, partnering with Australia, partnering with Japan and others, including financing.
Right. Right. I think a few challenges that I would highlight. One is that we need to strengthen the tools that we have as a U.S. government to be able to work closely with industry to make sure that they can be competitive in markets and they can compete with China in investments in ICT infrastructure overseas. I think the challenges that you were just discussing about cable regulation are important, and I have heard from companies that one of the potential unexpected impacts could be that companies will choose to route their cables differently, potentially not through the United States, if the process here is too burdensome or too time consuming. And I think getting that kind of message, that clear message from industry on what are the pain points, what are the bottlenecks is absolutely critical. And I think it's important for industry to work together to make sure that we are getting a clear understanding of what those issues are. And I think it could be helpful to see more coordination with industry as a whole, across the whole stack and the whole ICT ecosystem, in terms of enabling companies in the US and other trusted partners around the world to compete more effectively in markets. And I've talked with some companies about the potential for an association or coalition of trusted ICT infrastructure. I think that could be helpful in delivering that message to the US government, both executive, legislative branch, governments overseas, and I would be interested in hearing more from companies about whether that kind of model or what other kind of model would be more effective in terms of making sure that governments, both the US and elsewhere, understand what they need to compete against China in markets around the world, which is the perspective that I've come at it from. Whether it's the Pacific or other developing countries that are trying to make the choices now about what kind of infrastructure they want to build.
Yeah, and so, Mark Genzik was talking about not just looking at, just the cables, just the data centers, just the power, but it's the entire system, right? And it is at the multiple layers of the stack.
And it is all connected, and you need investment in one to enable investment in another.
Yeah, and you need the resilience across the board. You need the security across the board. So again, from your perspective, what could industry, private sector do to, along the lines that Steve just said, suggested, what would you want from the private sector to help you make the decisions that are actually mutually beneficial, right? Because the goals are very much the same, but oftentimes they don't get discussed that way, right? There's, the companies, there's government, and sometimes they don't necessarily even talk the same language. That's one of, you do, right? And maybe some of what you're doing is doing translations, simultaneous or sequential. So what do you think in terms of what's needed? What would help you make decisions?
Let me do the first piece of translation there that I see an opportunity for business to improve on. Because I talk with business all the time in a broad range here. Clearly communicating the consequences of the barriers to us is very helpful. And there's a version of that that's kind of grandiose and and a little bit less credible. You want to be credible, but you want to be precise. And so an example is like, if a cable deployment takes an extra year, what does that actually mean? Well, it means X amount of bandwidth was out, and not available. It means that there's a resilience or redundancy threat that wasn't present before of X amount, and try to quantify it. It means X amount of stranded capital, quantify that. Those specific things tied to specific processes give me a huge amount of leverage and power. When I go around and have these conversations, I can say, hey, look, you know what can unlock $100 million of value just like that? This, like we can just change this regulation. That kind of precision makes our job way easier and helps a lot in communication. So that's the first thing I would say. I would also tag keep, I know this isn't exactly responsive, but keep doing what you're doing in that driving forward the edge of business, driving forward the edge of innovation, and keep aggressive deployments there is essential to America succeeding, right? I am here in government to try to get the barriers out of the way so that you guys can drive us to prosperity. But your work to drive us to prosperity and stretching yourselves there and working as hard as you can is every bit as much of a patriotic duty as what I'm doing. And I want you to continue to act with that knowledge, because we're all striving to create the sort of prosperous future for our children where they're better off than us. And part of that is going to come from you guys taking the same missional focus that we have and focusing it on your businesses and your business lines. The last piece I'll add, because every good response should have 3 pieces, is that you should look at a more comprehensive view of where things may break when you're talking with us, and be able to identify those for us. I try to do this systematically, but you all will have deeper knowledge in your specific fields. Being able to take that synergy of database, power, comms, all these different things. That's just 3 that I know of. I'm sure there are like easily 10 roughly at that level. Being able to say, hey, the high risks right now are number 7, 2, and 1. Being able to tag that kind of thing for us is very helpful in letting us think more deeply about the problem and try to get to solutions.
No, that's great. And one of the things that I know that the industry would love to be able to hear is, back from you, is, what do you see as risks and threats? Because the companies, have enormous economic and, brand integrity incentives to not have anything break.
Yeah.
And so they're designing systems to not break or have breaches, et cetera. And sometimes the conversations in the past were, well, I'm sorry, we can't tell you that because of security. But I can tell you that a lot of the companies, particularly those that are in the networking business, the subsea, but other parts of it, have people with the appropriate clearances. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, how do we begin to have the conversations in trusted places to be able to share? Because the incentives are, I think, the same. You don't want anything to break or be vulnerable. Neither do the companies, right? And in the past, sometimes the conversations were like this. They were not handshakes. And so do you think that there's a way to create a mechanism to do that?
So absolutely. I mean, I've seen this risk of using essentially classification as a cudgel, which is like, oh, we know things you don't know. Well, of course we do. Fine. But the difference is, in order for us all to succeed, in order for America to succeed, we need to be enabling business to do its best work. And a lot of you will be more innovative than government can be in finding solutions. And so this is a thing that I am digging into. I don't have an announcement for right now, so forgive me for that. But that particular question is one that I've been aware of for several months and have been digging on. And
no, that's great. I think that there are people here who are going to say, or are going to applaud that because it's something I know that the companies have been wanting that dialogue. And again, with people who have the appropriate clearances and do it extremely carefully. Yeah. We're coming up on time. Is there anything that surprised either of you that you've been doing this a longer time in government than Joseph has, but that pops up that you say, wait a second, that surprised me, and I hadn't thought about that, but we need to address that.
Do you want to go for?
Go ahead.
Okay. What I'll just say is, one, the relative porousness within government, being able to engage with each other efficiently and get things done. I was very pleasantly surprised, so that's good news. I think the thing that I'm always, aware of is also that in DC, we all think deeply on certain things, but I think I was a little surprised at some of the separation from some of the struggles that are more, middle of the country, collapsed, cities and the things that I feel very tangibly when you're there aren't there's not as high of awareness of that, certainly in some of the bureaucratic apparatus. And so always keeping in mind and focusing on how do you keep that at issue, which is why are we doing this? We're doing this to make that opportunity come back, to make those people's lives better. That's a thing that I'm trying to hone in on.
Well, I'm continually surprised by how competitive and fast-moving the tech industry broadly, but ICT infrastructure specifically that I've focused on, how it continues to be a constant challenge to keep ahead, especially in our strategic competition with China. But at the same time, pleasantly and continually surprised by how innovative US companies are and their strengths, and the great potential there is for opportunity and the chance for us to work together as well to make sure that we're advancing US industry interests across the board overseas.
This has been great, and I think what I'm hearing from both of you also is the openness and the appetite to hear from industry, right, and have that conversation, because again, these sort of common goals and trying to work together. So thank you very, very much for a great conversation, and if you can help me thank Joseph and Steve.
Thank you for having us.